If it were not for his younger brother, the world may never have seen the famous paintings Starry Night, Wheatfield with Crows, or Sunflowers, all works created by the famous and troubled Vincent van Gogh. Though he did not achieve success during his lifetime, Van Gogh's paintings are some of the most valued works in the world. In 2015, Van Gogh's Atelier des Alicamps sold for $63.3 million at a Sotheby's auction. The most expensive painting to ever be sold at auction is Van Gogh's The Portrait of Dr. Gachet, which was purchased for a jaw-dropping $82.5 million at an auction in May of 1990. But beyond the monetary value of his paintings, Vincent van Gogh, whose name I won't be butchering by attempting the Dutch pronunciation, has come to typify that idea of a struggling, tortured artist whose creative passions undermined what otherwise might have been a contented life. His untimely death at the age of 37 was followed shortly thereafter by the death of the subject of today's episode. His brother's unwavering support, both emotionally and financially, of Vincent van Gogh allowed the artist to create some of the world's most enduring masterworks. And while his contributions, not just to his brother's paintings, but to the development of contemporary art, are not well known, Theo van Gogh deserves to be remembered. Theo van Gogh was born in the southern Netherlands on the 1st of May, 1857. He was one of a half-dozen children born to Theodorus van Gogh and Anna Cornelia Carbentus. Theo's older brother, Vincent, was the eldest surviving child of the family, although another boy, also named Vincent, had been born but died about a year before Vincent's birth. Theodorus van Gogh, their father, was a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church, a Protestant religion founded in 1571. As a minister, he didn't receive a large salary, but the church cared for the family's needs by providing a house, 2 cooks, a gardener, maid, a horse, and carriage. Their mother, Anna, has been described by some historians as strict and religious woman who would accompany her husband as he visited his parishioners. Her father, William Carbentus, was a bookbinder who had the honor of binding the 1848 Constitution of the Netherlands, thus being called the bookbinder to the king. Perhaps because of her father, Anna loved to read and write letters to her friends and family, something that she ultimately passed on to her sons, who exchanged hundreds of letters back and forth over the course of their relatively short lives. None of the Van Gogh children were described as having a strong constitution, except for Vincent. Theo shared Vincent's coloring, reddish hair and blue eyes, that had a tendency to darken to a greenish blue. Theo and Vincent originally studied at the local school, but their parents became convinced that the country children were ruining their manners, and so hired a governess to teach them at home. The brothers became close even when they were young, and Theo would later reminisce about the delightful games they played together in the family's home in Zundert in the province of Brabant. After one of his many bouts with mental illness, Vincent remembered the peaceful days of his childhood. He wrote, "During my illness, I saw again every room in the house at Zundert, every path, every plant in the garden, the view of the fields outside, the neighbors, the graveyard, the church, our kitchen garden at the back, down to a magpie's nest in a tall acacia in the graveyard." But the idyllic days did not last. Vincent was sent to a boarding school in Zevenbergen, where he is believed to have been desperately unhappy. He would remember this period of his life as austere and cold and sterile. With some assistance from an uncle, also named Vincent, who was a successful art dealer, the younger Vincent found a job at Goupil and Company in July 1869, selling art prints and reproductions to middle-class purchasers. Vincent van Gogh would not begin creating the art that would make his legacy to the world until his late 20s. Theo would join his brother at the firm of Goupil and Company in January 1873, the youngest employee there. Theo seemed to thrive at the art dealership while his brother, Vincent, did not. Vincent's temperament was not a good fit for a salesperson. He was eventually fired for taking a vacation without seeking permission from his employers first. But everyone in Vincent's family knew that the art dealership was not going to be Vincent's future. Theo wrote, "When the apple is ripe, a soft breeze will make it fall from the tree," and such was the case here. Vincent entertained the idea of becoming a minister like his father, but he didn't want to spend another 7 years in school training to become a clergyman. He worked for a time as a bookseller and a schoolteacher before finally settling on his desire to become an artist. Vincent was 27 years old when he began seriously painting. He found it distracted him from his inner turmoil, which was beginning to show more and more. He wrote, "I said to myself, I will take up my pencil. I will go on with my drawing. From that moment, everything has seemed transformed to me." His family was troubled by his seemingly erratic behavior, which was intertwined with his own version of religious asceticism. Vincent would refuse to bathe and insist on sleeping on the floor, even when a comfortable bed was available for his use. He didn't eat very much, mainly crusts of breads, and had a thin appearance. His mother wrote, I am always so afraid that wherever Vincent may be or whatever he may do, he will spoil everything by his eccentricity, his queer ideas and views on life. And his father was of the same opinion. It grieves us so to see that he literally knows no joy of life, but always walks with a bent head, whilst we did all in our power to bring him to an honorable position. It seems as if he deliberately chooses the most difficult path. The intensity of Vincent's passions disturbed others beyond his immediate family. Vincent fell in love with his cousin, Cornelia Key Vos Stricker, but she turned down his marriage proposal. He refused to accept it and approached Cornelia's parents with his pleas. According to legend, he held his hand in the flame of a lamp and demanded, "Let me see her for as long as I can keep my hand in the flame." Eventually, Vincent was driven off by Cornelia's father, mainly because he seemed unable to support himself, let alone a wife and family. Meanwhile, Theo was finding a successful career in the art dealership world. He worked at branches at Goupil and Company and The Hague in Brussels, and was eventually transferred to Paris, where he found himself at the forefront of the contemporary art scene. Theo's work helped bring, among others, the artist Claude Monet and Edgar Degas to the public's adoring eye. Theo sent his brother money for food and art supplies, and also tried to introduce him to other contemporary artists so that he might form some friendships with people who shared his interests. But Vincent's personality was so prickly that the friendships never seemed to last. One of the artists Theo introduced his brother to was Anton van Rappaur, a Dutch painter. They had a correspondence of nearly 5 years, but had a disagreement that Van Rappaur said he regretted for the rest of his life in a letter to Vincent's mother after the artist's death. Van Rappaur wrote, "Whoever had witnessed this wrestling, struggling, and sorrowful existence could not but feel sympathy for the man who demanded so much of himself that it ruined body and mind. He belonged to the breed that produces the great artists." Theo and Vincent wrote to each other often, and many of Vincent's letters to Theo have been preserved. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Theo's letters to Vincent, which seem to have been lost. It is through these preserved letters that historians have learned so much about Vincent's life. Of the more than 800 letters Vincent van Gogh wrote that are still in existence, approximately 3/4 of them are written to his brother Theo. When Vincent eventually committed suicide, an unfinished letter to his brother Theo was discovered in his pocket. Theo, who had spent his life honing his art dealer skills to spot and nurture talent, would offer Vincent encouragement and helpful criticisms of his work. Vincent, while developing his art skills, took in a pregnant prostitute, Sian Hornick, and her child, who were in need of shelter. He used Hornick as the model for his now famous sketch, Sorrow. Vincent added the line, "How can there be on earth a woman, alone, abandoned?" to the sketch, which was a quotation from the author Jules Michelet. It showed Vincent's belief that poverty was the cause of many of Earth's sorrows, like prostitution. Hornick would return to her old life, and Vincent let her go, unable to provide for the woman and her children. He continued to believe that poverty was what kept her trapped in her situation, and wrote to Theo, "She has never seen what is good. How can she be good?" Tragically, Hornick would eventually end her life by throwing herself in a river. Vincent went to live with his parents, who provided shelter for him, and wrote to Theo of his continued progress. Vincent sketched the local weavers, miners, and anyone who wanted to model for him. His artwork was dark and shadowy, displaying little of the vibrant colors that would make his later works so memorable. Vincent wrote to Theo, angry that his brother had been unable to sell any of his artwork yet. He wrote, "A wife you cannot give me, a child you cannot give me, work you cannot give me. Money, yes, but what good is it to me if I must do without the rest?" He fell out of favor with the locals when one of his models turned up pregnant, and the rumor was that he was the father. Partly to escape the scandal, he moved to Antwerp to study at the Royal Academy of Fine Art, but then left the school over creative differences with his professors. He then moved to Paris and lived with Theo for a time. At first, Theo was encouraged with Vincent's progress and wrote their parents, "If we can continue to live together like this, I think the most difficult period is past, and he will find his way." But living with Vincent was nearly impossible. As time went by, Theo stopped bringing friends home because they would inevitably get into a fight with his brother. He wrote to their sister, "My home life is almost unbearable. No one wants to come and see me anymore because it always ends in quarrels. And besides, he is so untidy that the room looks far from attractive. I wish he would go and live by himself." Vincent moved to a commune on the north side of Paris and eventually to Arles, where he immersed himself in his art and produced nearly 200 paintings. He loved his time in the country, and it reminded him of his childhood home. Vincent wrote to Theo, "My great regret is that you cannot see what I am seeing here." Theo married Johanna Bonger, whom he had met through her brother Andries. He wrote to his parents that he was engaged, and 2 days later, Vincent cut off a part of his own ear after a fight with fellow artist Paul Gauguin. According to legend, Vincent presented his severed ear to a prostitute at a brothel he frequented. His behavior was becoming even more erratic, and the townspeople described the artist as the red-headed madman. Vincent went to an asylum after that and wrote to his brother, "The kindness you have had for me isn't lost. Only transfer this affection onto your wife as much as possible." His mental highs and lows became more pronounced. It was from an asylum window that Vincent saw the scene that would go on to become immortalized in the work, Starry Night. Theo and Johanna had a son in January 1890 that they named Vincent in honor of Theo's brother. But Vincent killed himself in July of that year by shooting himself in the chest with a pistol. Theo was by his brother's side when he died, and he said Vincent's last words were, "The sadness will last forever." Vincent was buried in the Auvers-sur-Oise cemetery, and Theo attended his funeral, where he seemed to become unhinged by Vincent's death. He gave up his long-standing job as an art dealer and started a new business exclusively selling Vincent's paintings. Theo's former employers said he became a madman of sorts, like his brother. He was committed to an asylum by October of 1890, and then in January 1891, 6 months after the death of Vincent, Theo died from chronic illness, excessive exertion, and sorrow, although modern understanding of his condition calls it an organic illness. Historians believe that Vincent van Gogh might have been suffering from bipolar disorder or maybe a metabolic condition or both, which he exacerbated by starving himself, drinking alcohol, and working too hard. Though Theo was originally buried elsewhere, Johanna had his body exhumed and buried next to his brother Vincent. She published their private correspondence in 1914 and through multiple art displays and sales managed to make Van Gogh a household name. Theo van Gogh understood his brother more than anybody else, and he recognized the difficulty in balancing creative impulses with real life. He said, "One of the most difficult things is that whether in good or bad health, he is so cut off from the outer world. But if you knew him, you would be doubly aware of how difficult it is to solve the question of what can and must be done for him." But it is through Theo's efforts that the world would come to know his troubled brother's genius. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.